The other thing is when you're doing like weathering and streaking and stuff, it pays to start with a vehicle that's lighter than darker. Some of the first vehicles I did were like darker blue in color, and the weathering was I did a really good job weathering it, but you just couldn't see it very well. Like unless you got up really close and you're like, whoa, that's really cool. But part of this hobby is we want to show other people. I mean, I don't think any of us would be doing this if you couldn't show anybody. You know, I want to take it over to my mom's house and show her. You know, but if they can't see it, then they can't see it. So it's one thing I struggle in my head a lot. There's some things photograph really, really well, but they're so detailed that you can't really see them in real life. Which that's okay, but you got to have parts of that miniature that people can see in real life that really show up well. You know, subtle is neat, but sometimes subtle is so subtle that it doesn't. You know, you look at it and you're like, yeah, whatever. You know, like have you ever been to a contest and like the guy who like someone wins, and you're like, whoa, I didn't even notice that model. Like, or I saw that model, and then you look at it really close, and you're like, oh wow, that's but it didn't strike you. It didn't punch you in the face. You know, and I kind of went. I like having that punch you in the face moment, and then you look closer and you're like, oh wow, that's really detailed, and But I really like the contrast. I like being able to see the miniatures. So I don't know. That's my own little thing. Some people will say, oh, it's you just gotta get that minute, perfection, and but I don't know. I'm kind of weird that way. I guess maybe as I get older, my eyes get worse. Like, I just want to see my models, So. Okay, so we got that on there. Now, I usually go into a little glazing, but first I'm going to put some of that morphing brown, the reddish brown, just in like little spots, kind of haphazardly, in the darker chip areas. And this kind of breaks up that chip and makes it more interesting and gives it a little bit of depth. Now you can do this as little or as much as you want. Like if you're just doing it quick, one shade and you're done, it's great. I have a friend who did rust this way, but he did lots of different shades and in very small, thin layers, and just kept kind of stippling the areas. And when he was done, I mean, it looked like dirty, gritty rust. I mean, it had like some life to it. It had some texture, and so the more you do it, the more you can make it look real. It just depends on how much time you have. On the contest miniature, no problem. Do it as long as you want. Now the trick is you got to leave some areas that aren't like that, because otherwise it's just like highlights. If you put highlights everywhere, they're not highlights anymore. So if you put too much texture everywhere, it's not texture anymore. It kind of cancels itself out. So it's a fine line, just like when you were doing the metallics. There's a fine line between you put just enough shadow or you put way too much shadow, or in that part of it's just doing it over and over and over again. See what looks good. Pay attention. Okay, so I got those little bits in there. I'll even put a little bit of the lighter snakebite leather color in there, just in a couple of spots. And this is in my deepest, darkest brown color. Now, if you want this super, super rusty, you can bring it all the way up to like a bright orangish color, and that will be the newest rust. But if you notice, a lot of rust is almost like brown or black. It's very dark. Okay, so put that in there. Now what I want to do is I want to start discoloring the area around my chips just a little bit. So what I did is I grabbed a little bit of my snakebite leatherish color and a little bit of water, just to kind of make a little glaze. And what I'll do is when I mix my colors initially, I'll always wipe my brush out, because I don't want any thicker paint that's deep down inside my brush to suddenly come out when I'm about to do what I'm about to do. So I just always find if I start from clean again, it works better. So I'll grab some of that thinned out snakebite leather color, and then what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be putting my paint down and pushing it into the area I want it to go. And if it sticks over here, I'm going to push it again and again and again until I deposit more on this end of the brush stroke than this end. So what I'll do is I'll just start pushing some of that yellowish brown color into my rust areas. Now this color is forgiving, and it paints really well over a light color, so you don't have to worry as much about like rings or marks, because it's light enough to where it won't make those if you're careful. And you can actually start it further away from your chip than the darker colors. If you start a darker color too far away from the chip, then what will happen is your chip just gets huge. So what I'm doing is I'm just manipulating that paint, and I'm depositing it closer to my chip area. Now, some of this paint you can actually paint right over that darker brown, and it kind of changes the hue of the brown. So what's cool is you're starting to get all these different shades of brown, whether you know it or not. Then I switch into my darker morphing brown, and this one I'm going to keep closer to the actual chip. I'm going to use the same motion of pushing the paint and trying to get it to deposit more at the end of my stroke. This color is really good because it's got a lot of it's like a lot of saturated color. It's very orangey, and so you can get some really cool color nuances with this color. But it works better after painting the snakebite leather color first. And this one you can just kind of control where you push that color up into. It doesn't have to be all the way around the scratch. It could just be in a particular area of the scratch. You want it to always be different. Part of this is knowing, doing it a few times and knowing what it's going to look like in the end. So even if it doesn't look quite right at that particular moment, in your head, you're like, the end product is going to be right, so this is okay. Now, the better you get at painting, the more you can manipulate paints. If you notice, on the morphing brown, I didn't add any water. So I'm just using paint straight out of the pot, and I'm still getting that same, I can still manipulate the paint. But what's different is if you notice, I'm keeping the paint very flat on my brush. There's a little bit of paint, and that's it. The only water that's added to this is my own spit if I choose to add that. But then I can actually build up color very quickly, but still get a smooth transition to that color. The other thing with rust is sometimes you don't want it to be perfectly smooth. So there, even if you get a couple lines in a couple areas, that actually there's lines in rust and stuff. So you can get away with it. So I'm just going to pass this around, and you guys can see kind of where it's going. Yeah.
When you just, feel like someday, I'm going to give this up, and then the next day, it clicks.
I think my worst moments in life in painting were having a really, really good paint night. Have you had those where you just like, I'm on fire, and then waking up in the morning and seeing how bad a job you did, and you're just
you should have gone to bed
what the heck happened?
Ago,
It looks so good at a certain point. I didn't have anything to drink. I mean,
It's just fatigue.
Yeah. It doesn't happen as much anymore, but sometimes color choices are like you wake up and you're like, ooh.
You have to know when to draw that line. I mean, you may have the time and feel like you can stay up till 3 in the morning painting, but it might not be a good idea.
So the next step is doing little chips on our scratches, and that gives it more depth and more life. I found that I always use white for my chips. I'm painting a really, really thin line, and I'm just using straight white. And the reason I use white is because I can see it. That's it. I've used other colors, and there's a lot of people who say don't use white, don't use black, whatever. But I found that white shows up, and I can see my chip, and then I can manipulate that color later with other glazes and tones and stuff, and I can get all different shades of chips and highlights. But maybe part of that is just being a commission painter. I need to get things need to go boom, boom, boom. And if I'm layering up other colors on top of each other to almost white, it just seems ridiculous to me. So it takes too much time. So here's usually on when I'm doing freehand and when I'm doing chip highlighting, I like my paint to actually dry out a little bit before I start using it. Or I'll pull some paint to the side, and I just want that thin skim of paint on my palette. And I'm trying to flatten out my brush so that I have a flat edge of the brush. This works a lot better when it's starting to dry out just a little bit. But then I can just use that. I'm always just putting these chips right on the bottom edge or I'm putting the highlight on the bottom edge of the chip. I'm not putting it all the way around the bottom edge of the chip, but I'm kind of almost doing a stippling, going around. And I'm thinking in my mind, where would the chip highlight go away and where would it come back? So sometimes you get interesting highlights down the sides of chips. Another thing I do when I'm doing real thin lines is I'll just keep stroking till I actually hit the model. Because I can't see when my brush actually hits the model. So I don't think anybody can. I mean, sometimes I can, but it takes some of the eye strain off if you just do multiple passes. Also, this teaches you to draw a very thin line and hit that thin line over and over and over again. So you actually, when you're doing, what I always tell guys in my painting guild that I paint with, chips, like weathering is your first step to doing freehand. Because you have to make straight lines, you have to make crooked lines, you have to do really thin lines. And you do tons of them, especially, you get a customer who comes in like, I want the whole thing rusted, just as rusty as it can be. And then you're just doing tons of this stuff. So I consider a lot of weathering actual freehand on models, because it is. And it's a great way to practice, because if you mess up, no one's going to say, oh, that chip just doesn't look right. However, if you got the face on the back of a cape and you paint it badly, then it's bad. So the other thing I noticed when painting these little white highlights, a lot of times the first time you put paint down, what happens to paint when you put it on? Like if you put red over black, what happens to it? It's dark red when it dries, right? So you can get different shades of red with the same coat of red. Same thing happens with white, and the same thing happens with black. So if you're doing dark black lining on things, if you got your paint thin just a little bit, it will never paint down perfectly black. It will always have the color information from what was underneath it. So in that regards, I think it's okay to paint white and black on models, because you're not actually getting to the full white and you're not actually getting to the full black. I mean, you could if you wanted to. So that way I can have different shades of white or the highlight on these chips too, depending on how many times I hit it with the white. Also, if you're taking pictures of your models, that it actually photographs better with the white, I think, because it shows up, it gives you a little bit more pop, and you can see it in real life.